Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take that sprawling, often contradictory stack of sources you send us and really distill it into the essential knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
And today we are diving into a story that is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, genuinely unprecedented in modern political history.
Yeah, it's a life trajectory so wild it feels like it was cribbed from a screenplay.
Exactly. It's the story of Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelenskyy, the sixth president of Ukraine. I mean, if you look at the source material, you see a figure whose entire identity, from his background to his professional success, was just completely rooted in comedy and popular entertainment.
And then suddenly he's forced by these massive historical events to become the global face of wartime resilience.
It's that transition. That's the core paradox we're unpacking today. The shift from, a massively successful comedian and media mogul to a wartime leader.
We've got sources that track him from his birth in 1978, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, through this completely anti-establishment political rise, his assumption of office in May 2019, and then right up to the present day.
And crucially, his term has been legally extended because of the necessity of ongoing martial law. I mean, that fact alone makes him the second longest serving Ukrainian president after Leonid Kuchma.
So our mission today is really to navigate that transformation. We want you to understand not just what happened, but how the specific skills he developed as a showman, his mastery of communication, his ability to read an audience, leveraging media, how all of that suddenly became indispensable.
Right. These weren't just nice-to-haves. They became the essential tools for a head of state facing an existential military threat.
Okay, let's unpack this epic journey. We're starting with Section 1, the making of the showman.
And we start not in Kyiv, but in Kryvyi Rih.
What's immediately striking about Zelenskyy's earliest years, when you look at the sources, is just the layered complexity of his background. I mean, geographically, culturally, and historically.
It really speaks volumes about the overlapping identities of modern Ukraine. He was born in 1978 in Kryvyi Rih, which is a large industrial city.
And predominantly Russian-speaking.
Right, very much so. It's in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. His family was also Russian-speaking and Jewish. His mother worked as an engineer, and his father is a highly accomplished professor and a computer scientist.
So right away, this is not the background of a stereotypical nationalist political figure.
Not at all. And then you have this unexpected geographical twist in his childhood that almost nobody talks about.
I was just about to bring that up. He didn't spend all his early years there.
No, not at all. Before he was even 8 years old, he actually spent 4 years living abroad.
Abroad where?
In Erdenet, Mongolia, of all places. His father was a mining engineer and had taken up a post there. So it's just this interesting detail. The future president of Ukraine was absorbing these totally different cultural landscapes in his formative years, well outside the typical Soviet sphere.
But then his family history also carries this profound, immediate weight, especially when you think about the future rhetoric that would be directed at him by the Kremlin.
Oh, this is absolutely critical context. His paternal grandfather was an infantryman in the Red Army during World War II. He actually achieved the rank of colonel.
But on the other side of that story,
It's just tragic. His great-grandfather and 3 of his great-uncles were murdered in the Holocaust. The sources say his great-grandparents were killed when German troops set their home ablaze during a massacre.
horrific.
Yeah. And his grandmother, on the other hand, survived because she was evacuated deep into Central Asia to Almaty in Kazakhstan.
So just to recap for a second, we have a man who is Russian-speaking with a deep family history of service in the Soviet military fighting the Nazis and a direct, tragic connection to the Holocaust.
I mean, it sets up this incredible historical irony for what happens decades later, doesn't it? It just positions him as someone who understands the complexity of the region's history, not as some kind of political ideologue.
Despite this incredibly rich background, his initial educational path was actually very traditional. He got a law degree from the Kryvyi Rih Institute of Economics.
He did, but the sources are very clear on this. He never once practiced law. He pivoted, and he pivoted quickly.
There's an interesting early detail in there too, right, about his independence.
Yes, a great little anecdote. At age 16, he received a prestigious education grant to go study in Israel.
Wow, at 16.
Yeah, but his father prevented him from accepting the offer. And while he followed his father's wishes at that moment, his life's trajectory immediately shifted away from that academic path and straight toward comedy and performance.
And that launchpad was KVN, the Club of the Cheerful and Resourceful. For anyone listening who might not be familiar with post-Soviet culture, can you just break down what KVN was and why it was so influential?
Right. KVN wasn't just some college talent show. It was the cultural institution for humor and satire across the entire former Soviet bloc.
It was huge.
It was massive, highly competitive, centralized in Moscow, and unbelievably popular. Zelensky started when he was just 17, and by 1997, his team, which was called Zaporizhia Krivia Retransit, had won the major league.
And the audience for that, we're talking about tens of millions of people.
Tens of millions. That success led directly to him forming his own company, Kvartal 95, named after his childhood neighborhood.
So Kvartal 95 was founded in 97, the same year.
Exactly. And in those early years, they were just relentless. They were constantly touring, performing the highest open leagues of KVN. The sources detail they had some really rough times. They were often the only major Ukrainian team in that top Moscow-based league, and sometimes they were living without fixed addresses in Moscow while they were on tour.
And this is where we find a really defining early moment of integrity, one that you could argue foreshadows his political independence later on. I'm talking about the split from the KVN management in 2003.
This wasn't just a business disagreement.
Not at all.
No, it was a moment of profound principle. They split because of these prolonged mounting tensions. The sources cite a few key reasons: disputes over money, which is pretty standard, but also issues with political censorship being imposed by the Russian management.
And there was a specific incident, wasn't there? A very ugly one.
Yes, a highly notable incident involving a Russian KVN producer who used an anti-Semitic insult against Zelensky during a show.
And after all this tension, he had a clear choice laid up before him, right? A very comfortable, very lucrative choice for him personally.
He did. He was offered a highly paid individual job by the Russian KVN management. But there was a condition.
He had to abandon his team.
He had to abandon his entire team, Kvartal 95, and he refused. He turned down the offer, choosing to prioritize the integrity of his team and his own creative independence, and he returned to Ukraine.
That's a crucial data point, isn't it? Years before he even thought about politics, he showed he was willing to take a significant financial and professional risk for principle and for loyalty.
A huge risk.
So once he's back in Kiev, Kvartal 95 doesn't just survive, it explodes into what the sources call an empire, or a comedy factory.
It truly dominated the Ukrainian media landscape. Kvartal 95 studio became the most successful production studio in Ukraine, period. Their flagship show, Evening Kvartal, was the most popular comedy show of the 2000s.
And the viewership numbers were just staggering.
By the time he ran for president, it was reportedly seen by over 85% of Ukrainians. It was just a cultural touchstone.
And they were also generating international formats. This shows some serious creative business acumen.
Absolutely. They weren't just locally successful. They created a show called Make the Comedian Laugh, where contestants try to make Zelensky and one other comedian laugh to win money.
I remember seeing clips of this.
That format was so successful that in 2018, he stated it had been sold to 21 countries. We're talking places like China, Italy, Finland. This level of international media sophistication is highly unusual for a future politician.
Now, we do have to address the extensive Russian ties that existed right up until 2014, because that popularity, it was huge on both sides of the border.
He was a genuine cross-border celebrity. I mean, prior to 2014, he was extremely popular in Russia. He hosted the Russian X Factor in 2011. He was hosting these massive New Year's Eve shows on Russia 1 in 2013.
He was also a major figure in Ukrainian media management itself.
Right. He was the general producer for the Inter TV channel from 2010 to 2012, where he launched something like 30 new formats. He was a powerhouse.
And there's that other story, the one about the attempted bribe from the previous administration, which indicates that his reputation for independence was already known in political circles.
That's another one of those key moments of integrity that the sources cite. In 2018, Zelensky claimed that the administration of then-President Viktor Yanukovych had offered him a staggering amount of money.
$100 million.
$100 million in exchange for political control over Kvartal 95's programs. And he stated he flatly refused the offer. So it reinforces this narrative that he resisted political co-option even when the stakes were extraordinarily high.
But that relationship with Russia, the professional one, it came to an immediate and very costly end after the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
It was a clean break. Kvartal 95 closed its Moscow office, all of its Russian business ties were shut down, and Zelensky stopped working in Russia professionally by the end of 2014.
And the financial consequence was severe.
Severe and immediate. He estimated that this one decision slashed Kvartal 95's average revenue per hour of television programming from around $200,000 down to just $30,000.
Wow.
I mean, that is an enormous financial sacrifice. It really confirms the depth of his commitment to Ukraine's position following that first invasion.
And he didn't just cut ties. He replaced that commercial relationship with a patriotic one, quickly aligning his company with the war effort in Donbass.
He did. That decision really cemented his image as a national figure committed to Ukrainian sovereignty. From 2014 onward, Kvartal 95 started performing for Ukrainian soldiers in the war zone, and his studio reportedly donated 1 million hryvnias to the Ukrainian army.
And that, predictably, provoked outrage in Russia.
Oh, yeah. It led to some Russian politicians petitioning for a total ban on his works there.
This national turn also had an effect on the language he worked in, which had, up to that point, been predominantly Russian.
Yes. While Russian was his first language, and most of his productions were in Russian, his first acting role, performed entirely in the Ukrainian language, was in a 2018 romantic comedy called Me, You, He, She.
The sources have a really interesting note on the production of that film.
It's so complex. It was originally scripted in Ukrainian, then it was translated to Russian for a Lithuanian actress to perform her lines, and then the whole thing was later dubbed back into Ukrainian for release. It just highlights the shifting linguistic landscape of Ukrainian media at that time.
And finally, before we move on, we have that wonderful, almost surreal anecdote that perfectly captures the absurdity of his former life compared to his present one.
We have to linger on this for a second. It's just too good. The man who would eventually stand against the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II.
Addressing global parliaments, requesting complex anti-aircraft systems.
Also voiced Paddington Bear.
Paddington Bear.
He voiced the beloved character in the Ukrainian dubs of Paddington in 2014 and Paddington 2 in 2017. And Red in the Angry Birds movie.
This is a surreal piece of trivia.
It is, but it emphasizes his sheer versatility and, more importantly, his comfortable, familiar presence in Ukrainian households. This wasn't some distant, aloof public figure they were voting for later. He was literally the voice of comfort and humor for millions of families.
Okay, let's move into Section 2. The political hyperreality. This is the 2019 campaign. And the transition from showman to politician, it wasn't a slow evolution, was it? It was a deliberate, almost meta-theatrical political launch.
Right. It was built directly on the success of his most popular TV show. This is where we enter the realm of what scholars call populist hyperreality.
So the political party, servant of the people. It wasn't some organic grassroots movement.
Not at all. It was formally registered in March 2018 by employees of his company, Kvartal 95, and it was named directly after his hit TV show, which ran from 2015 to 2019.
And in that show, he played Vasil Petrovich Holoborodko.
An ordinary, idealistic high school history teacher who gets famous after a viral anti-corruption rant and is then, swept into office and elected president.
So his actual candidacy was essentially the final season to the show. He was running for the presidency as the fictional president. He had already been playing on TV for 4 years.
Precisely. The line between the character and the candidate was deliberately blurred. It offered the electorate this idealized, uncorrupted version of what a leader could be.
And his announcement was a media maneuver in itself.
A brilliant one. He announced his real-life candidacy on New Year's Eve 2018 on the 1+1 channel, and he pointedly overshadowed the traditional, pre-recorded New Year's address by the incumbent, President Petro Poroshenko. That move alone immediately established him as a disruptor.
And this strategy just perfectly positioned him as the ultimate outsider, regardless of the fact that he was, in reality, a very rich media mogul.
Well, he was a political frontrunner months before he even formally declared. His core appeal was pure anti-establishment and anti-corruption. His message wasn't focused on, traditional left-wing or right-wing policies.
Right, it was about integrity.
It was entirely focused on moral integrity, seeking to restore trust in politicians, promising to bring professional, decent people to power. The appeal was so simple. If the fictional history teacher could do it, why couldn't the actual comedian playing the history teacher?
The campaign itself was revolutionary for Ukraine. He avoided traditional rallies. He avoided the mainstream media almost entirely.
It was pioneering. It was, and the sources call it this, essentially the first entirely virtual presidential campaign in Ukrainian history. It relied heavily on direct communication through social media, especially Instagram and YouTube clips, completely bypassing the established political narrative.
And at his rallies.
His rallies were often rebranded as stand-up comedy routines, across Ukraine with his Kvartal 95 team. They drew these massive, enthusiastic crowds who were there for the entertainer, not for the stump speech.
But this media avoidance drew some pretty sharp criticism from established journalists.
It did. About 20 major Ukrainian news outlets publicly demanded that he stop avoiding journalists shortly before the election. They were concerned that he wasn't submitting to the kind of hard scrutiny a presidential candidate really needs.
And his response was very telling.
It was. He insisted he wasn't avoiding journalists, but that he refused to attend talk shows that he viewed as being dominated by, and this is his phrase, people of the old power, who were just using the platforms for PR. He felt that traditional media was part of the corrupt establishment he was running against.
You mentioned the scholarly analysis of this approach.
Right.
Let's define the terms for everyone listening. What did scholars mean by valence populism in this context?
Okay, this is really key to understanding his success. Valence populism doesn't rely on positional issues. It's not about, taxing the rich versus deregulation.
It's about values.
Exactly. It focuses on non-positional, universally positive moral concepts like anti-corruption, political transparency, and integrity. Everyone agrees corruption is bad. Zelensky's genius was making the entire election about this moral contrast. His fresh, clean, fictional persona versus the entrenched, self-serving, old power establishment.
And that focus allowed him to build this massive, ideologically diverse coalition.
From Russian speakers in the East to Ukrainian speakers in the West, it was a huge tent.
And the result was just undeniable. A landslide victory that completely broke record.
It was an absolute mandate. In the second round of the election, he defeated the incumbent Petro Poroshenko with a commanding 73.23% of the vote. That remains the biggest landslide in Ukrainian presidential history.
So he had enormous political capital right out of the gate.
A huge base to work from.
The debates leading up to that second round were also highly theatrical, weren't they? They were held in the massive Olimpijski National Sports Complex.
Pure spectacle. It completely reflected his entertainment roots.
What was the most stinging moment he delivered to Poroshenko in that debate?
The key moment of crystallization, I think, came when Zelensky acknowledged that he had actually voted for Poroshenko back in 2014.
Right.
But then he delivered this memorable, stinging line. He said, "We voted for one Poroshenko, but received another." He framed it as a betrayal of trust, arguing that the true Poroshenko was one who surrounded himself with controversial figures and sent greetings to Moscow through those politicians, while the one voters chose was only for the cameras.
So to wrap up the campaign phase, what were his main policy commitments for those first 2 years, beyond just the general promise of integrity?
Well, his agenda was primarily focused on economic reform, aimed at jump-starting investment. He saw corruption and a weak judiciary as the main roadblocks.
So the core promise was
a fundamental restart of the judicial system to restore public and international confidence. Economically, he also proposed a tax amnesty and a simplification of the system, including a flat tax rate of 5% for big business. He argued that if the government was genuinely honest, citizens and corporations would be incentivized to pay taxes honestly.
Let's move to Section 3, the early presidency. His inauguration in May 2019 was anything but traditional. He immediately signaled that he was going to govern with the same disruptive energy he used in his campaign.
Yeah, the sources show an immediate aggressive assertion of power. He was leveraging that massive electoral mandate. In his inaugural speech, he didn't waste any time. He immediately dissolved parliament and called for snap elections,
arguing that the existing body just didn't represent the will of the people.
Exactly. He said it needed to be replaced by new, uncorrupted figures.
And he quickly followed through on some other major campaign promises, specifically aimed at tackling the structural power of the old guard.
Absolutely. One of his first major victories was fulfilling a key promise, successfully stripping lawmakers of their legal immunity in September 2019. This was a hugely symbolic step. It ended a privilege that had long shielded corrupt politicians from prosecution,
making it clear that the rules applied to everyone.
Right. He also took immediate action on a specific foreign policy point by restoring the Ukrainian citizenship of the former Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, which was a move that reversed a decision made by his predecessor.
And there was also that notable controversy surrounding the annual Kiev Independence Day parade.
Yes. Zelenskyy canceled the traditional military parade on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which drew some criticism. His argument was that the money, estimated at over 100 million hryvnias, was better spent on veterans.
So he proposed a different non-military format to honor heroes.
Right. It was a move that really showcased his focus on populism and fiscal responsibility, even if it came at the cost of tradition.
When he started building his administration, he drew heavily on his past life. This led to the appointment of Kvartal 95 loyalists and individuals with ties to powerful oligarchs. That attracted immediate scrutiny.
It did. The appointment of former colleagues to key security and political roles was a huge talking point. Ivan Bakanov, a longtime associate from Kvartal 95, was appointed deputy head of the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU.
And his initial chief of staff had some very high-profile connections.
Yes, his team was initially led by Andriy Bodan, who had served as the lawyer for the controversial and powerful oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky. Bodan later resigned under pressure and was replaced by Andriy Yermak.
So this mix of trusted friends and politically connected individuals, it created some early turbulence.
It did. And let's not forget his sweeping administrative reform. He dismissed 20 of Ukraine's 24 oblast governors right at the start. He was determined to clear out those regional bureaucracies.
The fight against oligarchs became the central defining domestic policy of his pre-war term. But it's characterized by this deep dual narrative, isn't it? You have the success of the reform on one hand, and then the stain of the Pandora Papers on the other.
That tension is absolutely essential to understanding his early governance. On the reform side, he achieved a huge win in September 2021 by signing a landmark law that created a public registry of Ukraine's oligarchs.
And this law had teeth.
It did. It banned registered oligarchs from participating in state privatizations, it forbade them from funding political parties, and it required them to disclose their assets. This was a direct substantive attack on that deeply entrenched, corrupt system.
But just 1 month later, the Pandora Papers land, and they put him and his inner circle directly in the crosshairs regarding offshore activities.
This was a massive public relations headache for him. The Pandora Papers, released in October 2021, exposed that Zelenskyy, Ivan Bakanov, and Serhiy Shafir operated an extensive network of offshore companies.
Registered in places like the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, Belize.
Right. And critically, these firms were shown to own expensive London property. The source material reveals he had transferred his shares in a key offshore entity to Serhiy Shafir just before his election.
So for a man elected entirely on an anti-corruption platform, how did he manage to defend this? I mean, was the campaign pure performance, as his critics suggested?
This is where you have to look closer at the context. Zelenskyy's defense was very specific. He claimed these offshore firms were not set up for tax evasion.
But for protection.
But as a defensive measure, yes. He argued they were established under the previous, notoriously corrupt Yanukovych administration to protect Kvartal 95 Studios' assets from political pressure and potential expropriation, a practice that, while legally murky, was sadly pretty common in the media industry in Ukraine at the time.
So the argument was essentially that it was a necessary evil to protect creative freedom in a corrupt state. And did Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies actually validate that defense?
They did, which gave him a critical political lifeline. The National Agency on Corruption Prevention, or NAACP, investigated the allegations, and they concluded that they found no sign of conflict of interest, illicit enrichment, or unjustified assets.
And they confirmed no payments were received.
Right. They confirmed that neither Zelenskyy nor his wife had received payments from those offshore firms in 2019 or 2020. So while the optics were terrible, the anti-corruption candidate linked to offshore wealth, the legal justification held up, and that allowed him to push forward with his oligarch law reforms.
Okay, let's shift to the central foreign policy focus. The promise to end the war in Donbass, which was really the cornerstone of his campaign.
He took immediate proactive steps. He held his first phone conversation with Vladimir Putin in July 2019, urging EU-mediated talks. Then that autumn, in October 2019, he attempted to secure a preliminary peace deal. It's often referred to as the Steinmeier formula.
And that involved giving elections to the Donbass regions in exchange for
the withdrawal of Russian-backed unmarked troops. But that preliminary deal sparked a massive domestic backlash and protests, didn't it?
It did. Very significant backlash. Critics feared that holding elections under Russian pressure would just legitimize puppet regimes. They argued that displaced pro-Ukrainian residents wouldn't be able to return to vote, leading to an unfair outcome.
There were huge protests under the banner of No capitulation.
So Zelenskyy had to repeatedly defend the negotiation process, stressing that elections wouldn't happen without a full withdrawal of Russian forces first.
But the deal ultimately failed to de-escalate the violence in any significant way. He persisted, though. He met Putin face-to-face later that year.
Right, in December 2019, under the Normandy format, mediated by France and Germany.
And that pressure did yield some temporary results. They announced a formal ceasefire in July 2020. The sources point out this was the 20th attempt since the conflict began in 2014.
But this one was different, at least for a while.
It was. Despite all the previous failures, this particular ceasefire saw a substantial reduction in violence. Violations decreased by over 50% that year, which demonstrated a brief, fragile flicker of hope for peace.
And finally, before the curtain rose on the full invasion, there was that strange controversy surrounding his trip to Oman in January 2020.
This incident raised some serious questions about transparency. It kind of reinforced the skepticism of the old power establishment he was trying to replace. The trip was unannounced, and it only became public knowledge after the tragic UIA Flight 752 plane crash in nearby Iran forced him to cut his visit short.
And the media storm led to all these rampant rumors of unannounced meetings.
Right, potentially with influential Russian figures like Viktor Medvedchuk or Vladislav Surkov, though his chief of staff at the time vehemently dismissed these as baseless conspiracy theories.
But the controversy wasn't just about the rumors. It was about the official handling of the trip itself.
Precisely. When he was questioned in Parliament, the foreign minister was unable to provide concrete details about the visit's official agenda or its preparations. So his critics hammered him for a lack of transparency, the very thing he campaigned against. It was an early controversy that served as a reminder that governing required a lot more caution and accountability than campaigning did.
Now we enter the era that defines Zelenskyy internationally and irrevocably changed the direction of Ukraine. Let's look at the prelude to the full-scale invasion, marked by rising tensions throughout 2021.
As Russia began its serious military buildup, Zelenskyy definitely recognized the threat. He was urging NATO to speed up Ukraine's membership request as early as April 2021.
But as the end of the year approached, his public strategy seemed to sharply diverge from that of his Western partners, especially the United States.
That's a crucial detail. He seemed to be actively minimizing the threat publicly, even as Western intelligence was screaming about an imminent attack. While the US and the UK were warning about the highest readiness for invasion, Zelenskyy was deliberately focused on calming the Ukrainian populace.
He repeatedly urged citizens not to panic.
And he was publicly critical of the West. He specifically accused the Biden administration of creating mass hysteria that, he feared, risked crippling the Ukrainian economy through panic and capital flight. His assessment was that they did not see a bigger escalation than what had existed previously. He was choosing stability over alarm.
But then, just hours before the invasion, on February 24, 2022, he shifted gears completely, delivering that incredibly emotional address directly to the citizens of Russia.
It was an astonishing final attempt at diplomacy. He delivered it in Russian, the language he grew up speaking, and he made this direct emotional appeal to the Russian people, to journalists, musicians, scientists, even TikTokers, urging them to pressure their leadership to prevent the war.
He specifically disputed the Kremlin's claims about neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government, pointing to his own background.
He did. He knew the speech probably wouldn't be shown on Russian television, but he ended it with that provocative challenge that the answer to "Do Russians want war?" rested entirely on their own actions.
The moment the invasion began, the transformation was complete. Zelenskyy declared martial law and general mobilization, but the moment that really secured his legacy was his refusal to leave Kyiv.
That refusal was an act of profound political theater. It was instantly legendary, and it was strategically brilliant. When the U.S. and Turkey offered to evacuate him and his family, he delivered that definitive line. "The fight is here in Kyiv. I need ammunition, not a ride."
And the risk level for him personally at that time was just extreme.
Immediate and extreme. Ukrainian intelligence had identified him as Russia's #1 target. They stated the goal was to destroy Ukraine politically by destroying the head of state.
And the sources confirm he survived more than a dozen assassination attempts in those initial weeks alone.
Well over a dozen, primarily by elite foreign groups like the Wagner Group and the Kadyrovites. And what's fascinating, and it's noted in the source material, is that some of these attempts were reportedly thwarted by tips received from Russian FSB employees who actually opposed the war.
This unwavering presence and his communication strategy, it just immediately propelled him into global recognition. The comparisons to Winston Churchill started almost immediately.
His performance was masterful. He became the global face of national defiance. He was rightly named the Time Person of the Year and the Financial Times Person of the Year for 2022. He pioneered a new kind of wartime leadership, harnessing social media, especially those raw, shaky videos from the streets of Kyiv, to bypass traditional media and communicate directly with the world.
He became the first truly online wartime leader in history.
He did. And his virtual addresses to legislatures around the world became a central part of the global effort to rally support and secure aid.
From the EU to the UK, the US Congress, Canada, Germany, Japan.
And each address was carefully tailored to appeal to the specific historical sensitivities and political pressures of that nation. He was demanding, but he always framed the fight in these universal terms of democracy and freedom. He effectively made Ukraine's cause the world's cause.
Domestically, this stance created an unprecedented level of unity across Ukraine.
That unity was crucial for survival. Over 90% of Ukrainians supported his actions in that initial phase. And importantly, this included massive support, over 80% in the traditionally Russian-speaking regions in the east and south.
His defiance just shattered the Kremlin's narrative that the population would welcome Russian forces.
It forged a deep national consensus that had often eluded previous Ukrainian administrations.
And despite the intense fighting, he also had to manage that diplomatic tightrope walk, signaling a readiness for talks while refusing any notion of capitulation.
Well, the Kremlin's demands were clear: Ukrainian neutrality, recognition of Crimea as Russian, and recognition of the separatist regions. Zelenskyy stated he was willing to discuss neutrality and a new collective security agreement as a potential alternative to NATO membership, but he stressed it would not be for capitulation.
But his party was clear that they would never cede claims on Crimea, Donetsk, or Luhansk.
No. He had to balance military defiance with a show of diplomatic reasonableness for his Western backers.
We also saw the information war move into new high-tech territory, with the first major deployment of deepfake technology in a global conflict.
That was a significant moment in the history of disinformation. On March 16, 2022, a deepfake video of Zelenskyy surfaced online. It depicted him calling for Ukrainian forces to surrender.
It was crude, though. It was quickly identified.
Very crude, and it ultimately failed to achieve its goal. But it marked a historic first: the introduction of deepfake technology as a tool for major state-sponsored disinformation aimed at political destabilization.
Finally, the immense pressure of martial law led to some significant domestic crackdowns and a consolidation of power.
Under wartime necessity, he supported the suspension of 11 Ukrainian political parties that had demonstrable ties to Russia, including the influential opposition Platform for Life. His rationale was that any activities aimed at division would receive a harsh response.
And he also supported the consolidation of all national TV news stations into a single 24-hour state-run broadcast.
Right, the United News Telethon, for the duration of martial law. It was justified as necessary to maintain unified information and morale, though it naturally drew concerns regarding media freedom.
Okay, let's move into the later phases of the conflict. As it moved beyond that initial survival phase, the strategy shifted to long-term conflict management and really defining the parameters of victory. The stance on territorial demands has evolved over time.
Initially, there was the hardline stance in May 2022 that Ukraine would fight until every inch of territory was regained. However, reality had to temper that absolute goal.
He later conceded that attempting to recapture all the land seized since 2014, including Crimea, solely by force would just be too costly in human lives.
Exactly. He said it would cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. That was a significant acknowledgement of the human cost of an absolute victory. And then, following Russia's formal annexation of 4 occupied regions in late 2022, he announced definitively that Ukraine would not engage in peace talks while Vladimir Putin remained president.
His wartime diplomacy was often characterized by this sharp, blunt criticism of allies he felt weren't doing enough. He really wasn't afraid to call out major Western powers.
No, he used his platform masterfully to exert diplomatic pressure. He was particularly pointed toward Germany for its pre-war dependence on Russian energy. He also publicly criticized Turkey, a major NATO member, for having double standards.
He noted that while Turkey was trying to act as a peace mediator, it was also continuing to warmly welcome Russian tourists and facilitate trade.
Exactly. And he repeatedly tried to engage the one major power that has largely remained aloof:
China. China has been a recurring diplomatic frustration for him.
He urged Beijing to pressure Putin, arguing that without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. He also noted publicly that China had refused to speak with him directly since the invasion began, which really highlights the limits of Ukraine's diplomatic reach in the East.
Let's turn to the highly dynamic and often strained relationship with the United States. This moved from securing major aid packages in 2022 to a dramatic public crisis in 2025.
The relationship has been a geopolitical roller coaster. I mean, the high point was his surprise visit to the U.S. Congress in December 2022. That was a show of massive bipartisan support that secured the delivery of Patriot missile systems.
But the sources detail the February 2025 Oval Office crisis as a major historical turning point, really a nadir in relations.
It was. The meeting with President Trump was focused on a very specific, high-stakes economic proposal.
Right, the deal that would grant the U.S. rights to extract rare minerals from Ukrainian soil.
It's a major strategic and economic asset, and the context here is that the U.S. was leveraging potential aid for economic guarantees and assurances on resource access.
But the meeting itself just spiraled quickly. What led to the heated exchange and his reported eviction?
The sources paint a chaotic picture. The arguments reportedly focused on deep disagreements regarding the pace of anti-corruption reforms and, crucially, the speed and scope of Ukraine's mobilization efforts, which the U.S. was pushing to expand dramatically.
The tension escalated into a heated exchange involving President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance against Zelenskyy.
And the result was stark. The planned lunch, further discussions, the signing ceremony, all of it was abruptly canceled, and Zelenskyy was reportedly asked to leave the White House.
And the immediate geopolitical fallout was severe. A brief suspension of crucial military aid and intelligence.
It was a direct consequence of that breakdown. The Trump administration briefly suspended the provision of both intelligence and military aid for about a week. Aid was only restored after intense internal negotiation and when Zelenskyy agreed to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire contingent on Russian agreement.
Which Russia, predictably, rejected.
Right, so it never materialized, but the political concession was made to unfreeze that aid pipeline.
Despite that crisis, though, the relationship did stabilize later that year.
It showed the continued need for cooperation. By June 2025, following talks at a NATO summit, President Trump reportedly considered sending more Patriot missile batteries to Kyiv. And in October 2025, Zelenskyy publicly welcomed the U.S. decision to impose sanctions against Russia's largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil.
Moving back to domestic issues, the pressure of maintaining a defense force led to some very difficult decisions regarding military commanders and controversial laws on conscription.
The complexity of wartime leadership involves hard choices at the top. Zelenskyy decommissioned several high-profile military figures, most notably the Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny in February 2024.
And that was followed by Lieutenant General Yuri Sotol in June 2024 and LT Gen Mykola Oleshchuk in August 2024.
Right, the last dismissal coming shortly after an F-16 pilot's death. These moves were often framed as necessary to refresh leadership or address failures, but they were politically contentious.
The handling of desertion and mobilization also led to some harsh new laws.
In January 2023, he signed a highly controversial law punishing desertion with up to 12 years in prison. Critics said it was overly punitive for soldiers facing extreme psychological stress.
But that was later modified, wasn't it?
It was. Recognizing the public concern, the law was later modified in late 2024 to allow first-time deserters to return to duty without facing the full penalty.
And the age of mobilization has been a constant point of friction, especially with Western allies pushing for younger conscripts.
This has been a delicate balancing act. He signed a new mobilization law in 2024, which lowered the draft age from 27 down to 25. But crucially, in December 2024, he resisted immense pressure from the Biden administration to lower the conscription age further, down to 18.
Arguing that the younger generation needed to be protected for the post-war reconstruction effort.
Right. And then in February 2025, he introduced a kind of workaround. Special military contracts for volunteers aged 18 to 24, trying to increase manpower without the political and social cost of mandatory drafting of the youngest cohort.
He also unveiled his long-term strategic plan for victory in late 2024.
Yes, in October 2024, he revealed the comprehensive 5-point victory plan. This plan covered one geopolitical objective, likely focused on securing international guarantees, 2 military objectives, 1 economic objective for reconstruction, and 1 related to strengthening national defense structures. It was an attempt to provide a clear path forward for the nation and its allies.
Now let's revisit the anti-corruption fight, which even in the middle of a massive war remains a central domestic struggle. This culminated in a dramatic U-turn in mid-2025.
This episode really demonstrates the fundamental tension in his wartime governance, the need for centralized authority versus the popular demand for democratic integrity. In July 2025, Zelenskyy signed a controversial law that essentially stripped two major anti-corruption bodies, MBU and SPPO, of their independence.
That's the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office.
Correct. The law placed them under the government's direct control.
Why did this spark such an immediate and widespread public outcry?
Because these two bodies, NEU and SAPO, are viewed by the public and by Western allies as the most credible checks against entrenched corruption. Removing their independence was seen as a massive step backward for Ukraine's democratic commitments.
It drew intense criticism and widespread protests.
Across multiple cities. And even more significantly, EU officials warned that it would jeopardize Ukraine's EU accession efforts, which rely so heavily on judicial and anti-corruption integrity.
So he was faced with losing domestic support, losing his mandate of integrity, and potentially losing billions in international aid and his EU timeline.
Exactly. The pressure was overwhelming and immediate, and he performed a complete reversal. He submitted and signed a new law almost immediately that restored the full independence and safeguards of NABU and APO.
And he explicitly justified the U-turn by saying the state listens to public opinion.
Which proves that even during martial law, the commitment to democratic reform remains non-negotiable for the Ukrainian public and for its international backers.
Finally, before we transition, what about the environmental impact? He puts a specific name to the destruction caused by the fighting.
He has been relentless in drawing global attention to the environmental catastrophe. He described the extensive damage from the war, the ruined farmlands, contaminated rivers, destroyed forests, as an environmental bomb of mass destruction.
And an ecocide.
And an ecocide, yes. And it's important to note that ecocide is a specific crime under Ukrainian law. He even met with international activists like Greta Thunberg to raise awareness of this issue.
Okay, let's move into our final section, looking at his broader political positions and personal life. His fundamental stance on Western integration has always been clear, but with a crucial democratic caveat.
His commitment to Euro-Atlantic integration is foundational. He views both EU and NATO membership as constitutional goals and instruments for strengthening defense and modernization. His stated goal was to formally apply for a NATO membership action plan and full EU membership in 2024.
But he maintains that the final decision has to be put to a national referendum.
Always. It aligns with his populist roots. The people must have the final say on such existential questions.
He also took a strong stance against Russian energy infrastructure very early on, even before the full invasion.
He was a vocal and consistent opponent of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He called it a dangerous weapon, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe. He understood that the pipeline was fundamentally a geopolitical tool designed to bypass and destabilize Ukraine financially.
And beyond the immediate region.
He also affirmed Ukraine's support for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity during the Nagorno-Karabakh War.
Regarding the Middle East, his stance following the 2023 attack on Israel was complex.
It was a delicate balance. He unequivocally condemned Hamas's 2023 attack on Israel, and he drew parallels to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, he also affirmed Ukraine's long-standing support for the two-state solution and the recognition of Palestine,
emphasizing that international law must be followed and calling for the protection of all civilian life.
Right. He maintained a posture of impartiality in the broader conflict while condemning terrorism.
Let's discuss the sensitive issue of language and culture in Ukraine. Russian is his first language, but his commitment to Ukrainian culture is evident.
The language issue is so central to Ukrainian identity politics. Russian is his native tongue, but he committed to fluency in Ukrainian and English, hiring a dedicated Ukrainian language tutor shortly after becoming president.
And his position has been quite nuanced.
It has. He opposed targeting the Russian language itself or Russian speakers, but he agreed that Russian artists who had become anti-Ukrainian politicians should remain banned from entering Ukraine. He also supported the Ukrainian language quotas on radio and television, seeing them as essential for cultural protection.
On social issues, specifically LGBTQ+ rights, he made a notable request amid the constitutional constraints of martial law.
This came about after a public petition demanding equal rights for same-sex couples gathered sufficient signatures. Zelenskyy affirmed the democratic principles of equal rights, framing the issue broadly by stating that family consists of persons who live together, are connected by common life, have mutual rights and obligations.
And he requested that the prime minister review the possibility of legalizing civil partnerships for same-sex couples.
He did, but he noted that the ultimate goal of formal same-sex marriage requires a constitutional amendment, which is strictly prohibited while the country remains under martial law.
A major cultural and political maneuver involved targeting the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church within Ukraine.
This was a huge strategic move to sever Moscow's soft power influence. In late 2022, he announced a bill aimed at banning religious organizations affiliated with centers of influence in the Russian Federation, specifically targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which had long served as a conduit for Russian influence.
And that law was passed and signed in August 2024.
It was. It gives individual parishes a 9-month window to formally cut ties with the USCMP, leading to subsequent inspections and the potential for court-ordered bans for non-compliance.
A quick snapshot of his personal life. His wife, Olena Kiashko, was integral to his early career.
They married in 2003, and Olena Kiashko was a scriptwriter for Kvartal 95, so she was a partner in his creative empire right from the start. They have 2 children, a daughter, Alexandra, and a son, Kirlo.
And the family remains in Kiev.
They do. A fascinating detail is that their daughter, Alexandra, not only appeared in his 2014 movie 8 New Dates, but she also won prize money on the children's version of his show Make the Comedian Laugh back in 2016.
His career, both before and after 2022, has been marked by major recognition.
Before politics, he secured over 30 of Ukraine's Teletriumph Awards, but his wartime recognition has been on an unprecedented international scale.
In addition to being named Time and Financial Times Person of the Year for 2022.
He has received high civilian honors globally: the French Legion of Honor, Poland's Order of the White Eagle, the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, and the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award.
And the most unique, truly permanent honor.
That would have to be the extinct feather star, a Volodymyr Zelenskyy. A species of extinct marine life was named after him in 2022 by Polish paleontologists, explicitly citing his courage and bravery in defending free Ukraine.
It's a very unusual way to enter the historical record. And on a final political note, he stated clearly in September 2025 that he would not seek a second term once the war concludes.
He did.
All right, let's try to pull this all together. This deep dive, built entirely from the sources you shared, offers a complex portrait of a leader who arrived in power through artifice and television, but has been forged into a figure of historical substance by the crucible of war.
Yeah.
You, the learner, now understand the core paradox. The massive mandate he won through anti-establishment rhetoric, the internal struggles and reforms of his early term, and that ultimate transformation into an internationally recognized wartime leader who redefined the role of a modern president through direct, immediate communication and sheer, unwavering presence in Kiev.
His greatest skill remains his ability to communicate, but the analysis shows that the political terrain is getting harder, not easier. He has to balance the necessity of war with the demand for democratic integrity, as we saw with that rapid U-turn on the anti-corruption bodies in 2025.
And perhaps most critically, he has to navigate the changing winds of international support.
Which brings us back to that point of friction we discussed. His ability to manage his own image is unquestioned, but his ability to manage the political egos of his allies may be the true test of his statesmanship.
A lot of process and a fascinating journey from the comedy stage to the world stage. That's it for this deep dive. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and ready to analyze the complex legacy of President Zelenskyy.
Welcome to The Debate. When Volodymyr Zelenskyy swept into power back in 2019, his mandate was about as clear as it gets: destroy entrenched corruption and eradicate the stifling influence of Ukrainian oligarchs. This was really the defining promise of his entire political career.
And that promise set, the highest possible bar for institutional change. He came in as the ultimate political outsider, yet the record of his tenure is, well, it's riddled with political appointments and maneuvers that critics argue centralize power in the executive branch, potentially undermining the very institutions designed to ensure independent oversight.
So the core question we really have to address here, based on the source material, is this: did President Zelenskyy's domestic reforms actually achieve fundamental structural victories against oligarchic power and corruption? Or did these efforts primarily result in a, let's say, dangerous centralization of executive authority, often at the expense of those independent anti-corruption agencies?
I'm going to argue that while, yes, certain symbolic reforms were achieved,
the administration repeatedly demonstrated a preference for executive control and personal loyalty over real institutional independence. And that led to outcomes that, concentrated presidential authority.
And I'll contend that the administration delivered genuine, structural legislative victories that fundamentally alter the political landscape. They fulfilled core campaign mandates, even with the immense challenges inherent in dismantling such a deeply entrenched system. So let's begin with the case for substantive legislative victory. Okay, so Zelensky's new parliamentary majority acted almost immediately to implement structural change, which signaled a clear break from the past. Just months into his tenure, in September 2019, Parliament passed a landmark bill stripping lawmakers of their legal immunity. Now, this was not a minor point. It dismantled a foundational political shield that had protected the old elite from prosecution, from accountability for decades. It really opened the door for genuine legal scrutiny against powerful figures.
I see why you think that. I do. But let me offer a different perspective. Stripping immunity, while yes, politically significant, was probably the lowest cost victory available. It signaled intent without fundamentally disrupting the flow of capital or the oligarch's actual economic structures.
But the oligarch law was precisely that disruption. By September 2021, Zelenskyy successfully pushed through the oligarch law. This legislation was a direct assault on that fusion of wealth and power. It mandated a public registry of oligarchs. It barred them from participating in privatizations of state-owned companies. And crucially, it prohibited them from financially contributing to political campaigns or parties. This targeted the very means by which private wealth had captured the state. This is the kind of structural reform critics had always deemed impossible in Ukraine.
That's a compelling point about the law's intent, but I would frame the overall political approach quite differently. The administration's actions often seem to prioritize speed and maybe political spectacle over genuine institutional rigor. From the outset, the campaign relied heavily on what scholars called valence populism. This focus on non-positional, universally agreeable topics like anti-corruption, framing the fight as the people versus the elite.
And he followed through by passing laws targeting those very elites.
Well, the problem is that this populist framing set up these unrealistic expectations, while at the same time masking an immediate contradiction. The stacking of his administration with former personal colleagues from his company, Kvartal 95. You just can't claim to execute a clean break from the elite while appointing a team built on personal loyalty rather than, say, nonpartisan expertise. Specifically, the appointment of Andriy Bogdan, who had served as the lawyer for the deeply influential oligarch Igor Kolomoisky and who faced lustration questions that immediately poisoned the well. Similarly, placing Ivan Bakanyav, another close associate, as the deputy head of the SBU. It just demonstrated an uncomfortable reliance on a personal network in very sensitive security and government roles. This undermines those structural achievements you're citing.
But appointing trusted figures, particularly for an outsider entering such a hostile political environment, can be a necessary act of political pragmatism. You have to ensure loyalty and effectiveness. It's not inherently systemic corruption.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was merely pragmatism, because the subsequent revelations fundamentally contradicted the anti-corruption narrative. The 2021 Pandora Papers showed Zelenskyy and his inner circle operating a very sophisticated network of offshore companies, including one that held expensive London property. Now, while the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, the NACP, later found no signs of illicit enrichment related to payments after his 2019 election, the mere existence of these hidden offshore structures, while running on a platform of transparency, created a profound crisis of political trust. The optic of wealth hidden offshore is just devastating, regardless of the legality.
To the core debate about the integrity and the true independence of the anti-corruption infrastructure itself.
Precisely. We saw the dangers of that centralization impulse peak in 2025. In July of that year, Zelenskyy signed a controversial law that explicitly stripped the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO.
Right. And for the audience, it's important to understand that NABU and SAPO were created specifically to be independent of the executive and parliament, often with Western oversight, precisely because the traditional prosecutor general's office was so historically politicized.
Exactly.
These were the two critical institutional bodies designed to investigate and prosecute high-level corruption without any political interference. The 2025 law essentially transferred oversight and prosecutorial control to the government's prosecutor general, Ruslan Kravchenko, who is widely viewed as a presidential loyalist. This was an overt attempt to manage and control the very agencies that should have been autonomous. It represents a dangerous centralization of prosecutorial authority right under the executive branch.
Misstep, and it generated intense public outcry. However, the subsequent reversal demonstrates that the system, post-Zelensky's reforms, retained sufficient democratic muscle to push back successfully. The new bill restoring Nabu and Sapo independence was signed quite swiftly after widespread protest erupted across multiple cities. The administration's quick response, noting the necessity of listening to public opinion, suggests that while the initial impulse might have been flawed, the mechanism for accountability was ultimately effective.
A forced reversal, though, enacted only after substantial, multi-city protest, proves the initial, and I would argue inherent impulse of the administration was to undermine independent oversight the moment it became inconvenient. We can't just gloss over the fact that the executive sought to gain control over high-profile corruption investigations. That attempt alone really undermines the narrative of building truly independent institutions. It suggests reforms are tolerated only until they constrain presidential power.
But let's broaden the focus a bit. If the centralization impulse was really so dominant, then why did the administration simultaneously push through other fundamental institutional changes, like fixing Ukraine's long-broken referendum law, which was passed in January 2021? I mean, that speaks to democratic strengthening, not centralization. Furthermore, the existence of the oligarch law itself created a structural legislative barrier against oligarchic participation in privatizations and political funding. That is a permanent check on power that transcends any single political appointment.
And that brings us naturally to the oligarch law itself, the efficacy of the legislation versus the political reality of its implementation. You describe it as a bold structural move necessary to address the media and economic dominance of the old guard.
Precisely. They needed to fundamentally change the relationship between immense private wealth and state policy. The law was aimed directly at reducing oligarch dominance, particularly over broadcasters, which had suffocated fair political competition for decades.
That's a compelling policy goal, sure, but the devil is in the details of the mechanism they chose. The law's structure demands the creation of a presidential register of oligarchs. I mean, this is centralization in its purest form. It vests the executive with the power to arbitrarily define who is an oligarch and who is not.
But that concentration of power was the necessary precondition for structural success. In a political system so riddled with vested interests, where the parliament and judiciary had historically been compromised by oligarchic influence, the presidency was the only office with the necessary political capital, especially after the 2019 supermajority, to actually enforce such a sweeping measure. Without a central body dedicated to enforcement, any objective definition of an oligarch would have been immediately litigated, filibustered, and ultimately overturned by those entrenched interests. The centralized mechanism was a kind of political battering ram required to breach the defenses of the old elite.
It may have been politically expedient, but it is institutionally dangerous. The ability to arbitrarily label a political opponent, a critical media owner, or a business rival as an oligarch, and thus strip them of political rights, means that the executive substitutes presidential discretion for the rule of law. That is not institution building. That is power consolidation. And this fear was amplified by those initial appointments we talked about, like Kolomoisky's former lawyer, Bogdan, which immediately raised questions about whose interests the presidential office would truly serve when enforcing this powerful new law.
So if we accept your premise that the administration was primarily concerned with centralization, then we have to look critically at the tension between transparency and pragmatism. And this is where the administration faced its biggest crises of political image.
And the administration failed that test. The trip to Oman in January 2020 stands as a major lapse in the transparency he promised. Zelenskyy combined a personal holiday with undisclosed government business, a level of opacity that his anti-establishment campaign had explicitly promised to end. The lack of accountability was exposed when his own foreign minister, Presidency, couldn't provide a clear official agenda or details to Parliament about the purpose or preparation for the visit. For a leader who promised to govern openly, this secrecy just directly contradicted his core mandate and eroded public trust.
That trip was poorly handled, certainly, at least in terms of communications. But let's put the transparency concerns, particularly those around the Pandora Papers, into a historical and pragmatic context. Zelensky's defense regarding the offshore companies was that they were established to protect his studio, Kvartal 95, from political pressure and possible raids under the notoriously corrupt Yanukovych administration.
But setting up offshore holding companies is precisely how the old guard, the very people he campaigned against, shielded their wealth from accountability and taxation. That excuse, that this was common practice in the media industry at the time, it just doesn't hold up for a leader who promised to be the transformative exception.
But it reframes the motivation, and motivation matters fundamentally in this debate. If the offshore structure was defensive, aimed at protecting creative and commercial assets from state predation under an oppressive regime, that is political pragmatism. It is fundamentally different from using offshore shell companies for illicit personal enrichment while in public office. Furthermore, he did take steps towards divestment, handing over his shares in the key offshore company to Serhiy Shefir around the time of the election. This shows an effort to separate his private business life from his public office duties, even if the timing was imperfect and the arrangement complex.
The separation was complex, and it was secretive. Transparency, especially for a leader who rode into power on a wave of popular dissatisfaction with political opacity, can't just be waved away by citing the need for a pragmatism used by the very corrupt system he promised to dismantle. The lack of forthrightness regarding past dealings and the controversial appointments of figures tied to oligarchic interests, it created a cumulative distrust that weakened the legitimacy of his legislative victories.
Ultimately, for me, Zelenskyy followed through on substantive legislative promises, stripping immunity, enacting the oligarch law, and reforming referendum rules, all of which were aimed at fundamentally altering the relationship between state, parliament, and wealth. These were institutional changes designed to reduce the privileges of the old elite and increase democratic participation. This demonstrates a sustained commitment to institutional reform, even in the face of immense political opposition and, the ultimate tragedy of war.
Yet the record remains profoundly mixed, and it demonstrates that structural legal change is just insufficient without genuine, unwavering accountability. Initial legislative wins were repeatedly tempered by issues of transparency, like the Oman trip and the Pandora Papers revelations. And more critically, we saw the executive's controversial attempt in 2025 to centralize power over Nabu and Sapo, a move only reversed due to massive public outcry. This proves the underlying tension between executive authority and truly independent anti-corruption infrastructure remains potent.
I think we have to appreciate the sheer complexity of trying to transform a deeply entrenched, corrupt system like Ukraine's. Zelenskyy initiated sweeping legal and political changes aimed at dismantling oligarchic power, a feat that was long thought impossible.
Accountability clearly requires continuous scrutiny of the administration's actions versus its founding promises, recognizing that the battle between centralization and independence is, well, it's ongoing.